Okay, so there we go. Now we're ready to go. So thank you for joining us here today. Again, this is Alan Falcon, CEO of Cumulus Global, and I want to welcome you to our October 3rd Tuesday at 3 webcast. I think we've got the video and audio technical difficulties out of the way here. Had to reset a couple of things at the last minute. I appreciate your patience and always appreciate you taking time out of your busy day and week to join us either for the live broadcast or for watching it on demand. As a reminder, the audio for the session for everyone is muted. That prevents any background noise from getting in the way. So if at any point in the time you have a question or a comment, along the top or right-hand side of the screen, there's an icon that opens up the questions window. We have plenty of time for Q&A, and we'll answer them along the way, but this is the best way to get in touch with me, lets me track what's going on, make sure we get everything answered before we leave the session here this afternoon. The session is being recorded. We generally don't record the Q&A at the end. We'll take a break, stop the recording, and get back to Q&A. We'll post the recording within 24 hours typically, and we'll send you an email with a link to the recording. Feel free to share it with others who you think might find it interesting. The third Tuesday at 3 webcast series is part of a number of resources we offer, educational and informational. We like to provide ideas and information to not only our clients, but to small businesses in general when it comes to leveraging technology to achieve your business goals. And so please check out our blog, our library of ebooks and white papers, this webcast series, and our Coffee and Clouds series as well. Well, this session is a third Tuesday at 3 webcast event, tends to run 40 to 45 minutes plus Q&A. Our Coffee and Cloud series are very specific topics. They run 15 to 20 minutes plus Q&A, and we've got a recording of a number of hot topics there available on our website. As we start talking about cloud file services, we want to sort of put it in context and talk about the evolution of file services. And we're all familiar with having file servers, physical devices where we keep our files. And again, over the years, these have been centralized. They've been local area network file servers, maybe at the departmental level or the business unit level, or back in corporate IT. And really, they provide businesses with things that we're pretty commonly used to, right? Storage capacity, that's where all the space is. It can be personal file space. It can be shared and centrally managed file space. Typically, when file servers are put in play, there's clear ownership. And there's a team of IT people who manage the permissions, who can see what. You don't want everyone, for example, in the accounting folders. You want to keep that secure. So whether it's keeping people outside out, or keeping people inside only with access to the information they're supposed to access, we have those permissions. And because it's physical server somewhere, and this can be, typically it's on-premise, it could also be in a hosted environment where you have these servers, you are talking about command and control and running it yourself. And what we often find with physical file servers is there's some competition for resources, either within the business unit or the file server may serve more than one purpose in the computer room, particularly with smaller businesses. And so you might have file service competing with an email server or with other security services or an application for system resources within the physical hardware itself. So we talk about, why file servers have worked so well, and what they've provided our businesses over the years. And we think about a cloud file server, okay, that really defines what we want and need. And at the summary level, at the high level, what we're really looking for with file services is a well-organized, secure method that provides ubiquitous access to information, right? We want to be able to get to our files, get to our data from whatever device we're working on, whether we're inside the office, whether we work remote or whether we're traveling on business, we want to get it there. We want it well organized. We want to be able to find things, know where things are stored, understand when information is placed and where as part of our workflows, and we need that to be secure. And so, like a file server, as end users, as consumers of the service, if you will, we're looking historically for it to behave in certain ways like a file server, right? And that means it integrates with the operating environment. So you boot up a Windows laptop or you boot up a MacBook, you can browse files on your file server, right? We expect that if we're going to move into the cloud, we want to be able to browse files in the cloud. We want it to be the data to be accessible from non-cloud applications, right? So that you might have business applications, operational systems that run locally. They should have access to the files they need as well. And I've already mentioned the ability to browse and a robust search. And so we wanted our cloud file service to be like a file server. It's what we're used to. It's how we organize our information. It's how we run our business. It's how we support our applications. But the reality is, we want, and even I'd argue need it to be better, right? Because some of the things that cloud file services bring into play that cloud file servers don't do as well are what we'll call single point of reference and improved collaboration. And let me elaborate just a little bit before we move on. When we talk about single point of reference, this is the whole issue of how things tend to evolve and work in a traditional IT environment, right? I log into my computer. I've got a home directory. It's my personal workspace. I write a document. I need other people's feedback on it. Most frequently performed operation in a traditional on-premise file server environment with the hardware is I will then send an email with that document attached to the 3 people who need to review it, and they'll save it to their disk and open it in Word or Excel, whatever, put in their comments, maybe track changes, and send their comments back to me. And I'll get 3 copies of the document back, and one by one, I'll compare versions. I'll accept and not accept certain changes. I'll step through all 3 there. When we head into the cloud, we enable a different mindset in how it works, right? I build my document, it's in the cloud. I don't actually send a copy to people. I share access with people. So I have 3 people who I want to review it. I send them a link. I give them access to be able to review. Maybe I let them edit it directly. Maybe I only let them comment and make suggestions. Every single person goes into that single point of reference, that single version of the document. Their comments, their suggestions, their edits are tagged to them. People can see each other's comments and feed off of that. And so someone might walk in saying, I want to change this paragraph from A to B, and someone else will suggest A to C. And the first person might go back and say, yeah, A to C is better, but we should change this part to D, E, F. And you can have that sort of inline conversation. And that collaboration can be in a serial fashion like it is historically, where you have to wait for me to send the file and then you put in your comments and get it back to me. You're working on your time schedule, I'm working on mine. Certainly in the cloud, that still holds, right? But working in the cloud and having that cloud file service behind you also means we can do things in real time. So I can share a document with you and say, this is a quick review. Let's get together for 15 minutes. We can get into a meeting, be video conferencing, both have the document up and open, and both be editing and moving and making suggestions and reviewing what each other is adding and modifying. And we can make those edits in real time. And so you can get, with a well-designed cloud file service, you can get the capabilities that you want and need from your traditional file server environment, but you get something better, and you get that single point of reference, and you get that improved collaboration. And you get a lot of clarity, not having to reconcile 3, 5, 7, 10, 12 versions of a document into one, not having to track which version of the Word doc and how did you name it so you know which one's the current and which one's past, and who edited who, because everyone's going to name theirs differently when they make their changes, if they change the name at all before sending it back to you. You have one version of the document that has everyone's suggested changes or everyone's changes in it that you can then manage and work with and come to resolution. And so it improves collaboration, both on the ability to get input, but the ability to manage that input, consolidate, reach consensus, and move forward, while eliminating all of the overhead of just managing the number of files you have in your inbox, in your file space, in your sent folder, what have you. Okay, now the most common cloud file services today, I didn't put Dropbox up here because Dropbox is sync and share. Dropbox is effectively saying, hey, I've got storage, I'm going to work, it's going to sync it up, I'm going to share with people. They'll make edits, it'll share up. If you're sharing with multiple people, you have to worry about record locking and precedence. That's different. The two most common cloud file services are Google Drive as part of the Google Workspace suite and OneDrive as part of Microsoft 365. And fundamentally, these two technologies are pretty similar. They parallel one another in that it is designed to be personal workspace, meaning to each her own, to each his own as far as ownership. So anything I create in my drive, in Google Drive, I own. I have the ability to share. Now, administrators can restrict external sharing. They can restrict sometimes some types of internal sharing. In the enterprise versions of Google Workspace, you can have some rules around internal sharing. That's great. But I basically get to own the file, share it out to people who I want to collaborate with, and work well. Now, if I'm working in the native Google editors or in the web-based editors for Microsoft 365, all of those are happening in real time. If I'm using desktop, if I'm using Microsoft Office, for example, Microsoft Word on my desktop, each time that saves, it's going to sync up to the cloud, and it'll work in a serial fashion like a traditional file server would there. And so this nature of Drive and OneDrive is very much a peer-to-peer sharing. And it differs from the traditional file server because traditional file servers, typically when people have personal workspaces and home directories, they don't necessarily have the ability to determine who it's shared with, right? That's still done at an administrative level. So here, the individual end user has the ability to set up the peer-to-peer sharing that they need, which makes it convenient, very agile and flexible and intuitive for users, right? And there are limits within Drive and OneDrive with respect to searches and how those work, and what happens if I own a file and I've shared it with people and then I leave the company and they delete my account. What happens to ownership of that file? It's been orphaned a bit. How does that transaction? So there's some management and administration that's required and some planning around how you onboard and offboard employees. But you get with Drive and OneDrive, even with the challenges, a very effective work environment. And that's good for personal workspace. It's not great for teams in team-based projects or overall corporate file services, if you will, because each user is responsible for their own ownership, right? So you don't want someone in the finance department or your accountant or your bookkeeper accidentally sharing a folder with everyone in the company or with people in the company who shouldn't have access to that information. You want tighter controls and you want explicit permissions management. And that's where in both environments you have other options. In the Google Workspace environment, it's shared drives, and in Microsoft 365, it really is SharePoint file services. And remember that SharePoint, and it also actually, SharePoint file services is file services. It's also embedded in SharePoint sites, and SharePoint file services is also embedded in Microsoft Teams. And so whichever interface you're using to present the file structure, you have the ability to create centrally managed file space. And when we talk about centralized file space, we're talking about an administrator. An account administrator has the controls over creation and modification of those structures, whether it's channels in Teams and file structures in Teams, or SharePoint file service directories and subdirectories, or SharePoint sites that have directories and file cabinets built in. And that central administrator will then manage permission assignments, and that can be to individual groups, individual users or groups of users, and follows the general inheritance rules that we're used to. Okay, now shared drives, you work on a membership basis. So you've got members of shared drives and managers. Managers have certain rights and different tiers of permissions on what they can change from a permissions and an access standpoint. Members can be controlled as to whether they can edit, modify, or view. And those permissions start at the top level and they propagate down. Both shared drives and SharePoint offer different mechanisms for managing individual file permissions and individual subfolder permissions. When you get into shared drives and SharePoint, you start to see file and record locking services, which makes collaboration a bit easier. There's improved search mechanisms. Both Google Shared Drives and obviously SharePoint have direct Microsoft Office integration, and both have the ability also to push content to the users. And so, this is where you start to say, okay, I've got the infrastructure I need to build a cloud file service for my company. I can provide people will have, and I can provide that personal workspace they need, and I can centrally control shared workspace or even individual workspaces and manage those permissions for appropriate security and compliance and policy enforcement. And so between those two mechanisms, we've got the foundation for a really robust service. The third piece that comes into play is really about how then do I connect my applications. Now, obviously, if you're working in Google Workspace and you only use the Google editors, do you really need a desktop? Do you really need a link to your desktop? What we find is most small businesses, even when they're heavily invested in Google Workspace, will have applications that still will look for, that don't have a native interface to Google Drive. Now, for example, Adobe Acrobat, you can add a module that gives you the ability to access Google Drive directly without having to have a cache locally on the hard drive. But there are applications that will only work with files that appear to be either on the local device or on a traditional network server. And so for that, both Google and Microsoft offer clients that run on both Mac and Windows PCs. The OneDrive client and the Drive for Desktop client effectively give you a network drive or map drive capability. It lets you select folders. Both of these products have been upgraded recently to allow for multiple accounts. So if you have a personal Gmail account and you have a business Google Workspace account, Google Drive for Desktop, you can have both accounts set up and you can decide what folders from each account you want to quote unquote sync or cache to the local drive. Now, by default, we always recommend that with both OneDrive and Drive for Desktop, you choose the cached local access mode. What this means is that the files you're working on and your recently worked on files will be cached on your local hard drive and will sync in real time as you work on them. And you'll be able to browse and access any file in your environment. What it doesn't do is operate as sync and share. So it's not going to say, hey, connect to this spot in Google Drive, and it's not going to automatically download everything to your hard drive. Okay, that would overwhelm most laptops, whether you're on Microsoft or Google. Both products also offer the ability to do local drive backup, and I put backup in quotes because, yep, you're making a copy of what's on your drive, but in effect, that's a sync and share. It's a sync mechanism. You have limited version control as far as recovery. It's really more about saying that, hey, if I'm running the OneDrive client and I tell it to quote unquote back up everything on my desktop, everything in my documents, and all of my photos, then everything in those three spots on my computer will become folders within my OneDrive client in the Microsoft 365 cloud. If I then go to another machine and do the same setup and say, hey, I want to sync my documents, my desktop, and my photos, then that second machine will connect to the same cloud, and both of those machines will appear to be in sync. And a change made on one machine will be visible on the other because the storage really isn't on the local drive. It's cached on the local drive, it's synced, and it's kept in the cloud. Okay, and so it's a more robust way of operating. And so it gives you both sides. The primary use that we see of Drive for Desktop and OneDrive client is very much creating that local cache, providing, for most of our clients, it's a Windows-based experience as to what your files look like in Google Cloud, and it's really appropriate if you still have people who need and use Microsoft Office, if you do a lot of work, with PDFs and other files where you need to edit them, where you might have business applications that are generating reports and putting output files, and you want those available. It really provides that mechanism. So now let's talk a little bit about the process of moving to cloud and some of those expectations. So when should you be thinking about cloud file services, right? And there are a couple of different ones, and you might hit one or all or some of these at any given point in time. So a good time to really think about moving to a cloud file service is when your existing file servers are approaching their end of life. Every piece of hardware has a life cycle. For file servers, it tends to be closer to 5 years than the 3 you would have with a desktop or a laptop. So as you start getting into year 3 or even year 4, maybe year 3 of the life cycle of that server, think about, okay, when this server goes, what do I want to do? Do I really want to invest in another chunk of hardware, migrate everything over, plan, upgrade the machine, plan for more storage for ongoing capacity, and have that capital expenditure and the ongoing maintenance of the physical device as well as the operating system, et cetera, et cetera? Or is now the time to say, hey, if we can move everything on that file server into cloud file services, I can simplify my physical infrastructure, reduce my physical footprint, scale what I need based on my actual utilization, potentially lower costs, but certainly provide some other capabilities. And we'll talk about some of those other value propositions that come into play. Another good time to think about cloud is when you've got a hybrid user community. And certainly businesses were heading and have always, most businesses have always had some level of mobile and remote users, even if it's only because someone's homesick or someone's traveling on business. Now with COVID-19 and coming out of the pandemic, we're realizing that, hey, a lot of people could work from home or work remotely or as a mobile user for some or all of their time. Other people will need to be in the office some or all of their time as well. So if you're moving and you want a stable, effective hybrid user community, cloud file service is a way to go. Why? Because the access, whether you're on premise, on site in your offices, or you're in a hotel room, or you're working from home, it doesn't matter. If you have access to the internet, you have access to your data, you can get your work done without having to build a multi-layered complex infrastructure to provide remote people access to on-premise equipment. And we've talked in other events, even when we talked about managed cloud services in a recent webcast, we put up a diagram of the complexity of having the firewalls and the VPN concentrators and the tunnels. It's a lot of overhead. It hurts performance. It adds complexity and cost and administrative time and IT dollars, both capital expense and operating expense on an ongoing basis. So having that cloud file service eliminates a lot of that, or the need for most of that, and simplifies your environment and lowers your cost. Good idea to talk about cloud file services if you're looking at integrated workflows. And again, your data is in a central space. It's secure. It's accessible. You can build workflows and processes around it. It's not great for transactional systems, right? If you have, computers controlling, process machines on a manufacturing floor or in a distribution center, the files that they're reading and in writing may not be good candidates for sitting on a cloud file server. Some products are designed specifically not to be on cloud file services remotely. For example, the consumer product Quicken will have trouble if you save your Quicken your data file in a place that's being synced up to the cloud, because it assumes exclusive access to the file and won't necessarily be able to write or back up data if the sync process is running. And so for certain types of transactional systems, cloud file services won't work. But unless you've got that sort of application or system level restriction, many, many benefits for deciding when you're going to move physical file servers into cloud file services. Another thing to consider is data security and data privacy, right? And we talked about My Drive in the Google Workspace environment and the Microsoft 365 OneDrive application being personal storage and having your shared drives and your SharePoint respectively, that gives you your central administration and folder and file level permissions that you can manage. It's also important to note that both Microsoft and Google offer business and enterprise tiers of product, and typically at the higher end of the business licensing or in the enterprise tiers, you get enhanced controls for managing permissions, tracking access, reporting on access and security, as well as tools for confidentiality and even digital rights management. to the point that you know you can actually save I'll use Microsoft as an example with some of the with the right Microsoft 365 licensing. You can turn on and configure digital rights management, and as you type a document, certain phrases, keywords, or topics will trigger the artificial intelligence engine to recognize that that is something that's likely confidential. Microsoft 365 can automatically watermark it as confidential and can apply security settings such as, hey, don't allow this to be emailed or shared outside of the company, or don't allow this to be printed. And you can really have that sort of automated and part of your environment here. Additionally, to attain security and privacy, there are a number of third-party tools. The good ones that we like, will provide content-sensitive application of policies. And so you can say, hey, here are the rules. Documents with certain types of information need to adhere to these rules. We'll set up those rules. If someone has a document with that type of content and the permission settings don't adhere to the rules, it'll alert. And with some tools, it'll actually remove the offending, remove and document that it's removed the offending permissions and notify the owner or IT or security officer that something happened. And so you can get much more sophisticated and much more automated in your security privacy in moving to a cloud file service, but it's something you want to plan out and you need to understand as you go forward and make that change. The next component is backup recovery, and I'll throw continuity in there as well. And really, it comes down to, and what you see on the screen is known as the shared responsibility model. Both Google and Microsoft, in fact, almost every cloud provider we've ever looked at where customers are putting in their own data, have some form and degree of shared responsibility. And basically what that means is the responsibility for your data with respect to what you're doing, the vendor is going to take responsibility where they are ensuring that they're providing the service and providing access. You as the user of that service take responsibility for your data that you create, that you modify. If the system says, hey, you have the ability to control permissions, then managing permissions is your responsibility, not the vendor's. And even on backup, right? And when you look at, here sort of vendor versus customer, let's use Microsoft 365, that's SaaS, right? Microsoft provides the applications, right? They provide Word and Excel, PowerPoint and Outlook and Delve and Teams, right? The identity management and directory infrastructure is the shared responsibility. They provide the mechanism, you provide the settings. It's your responsibility to manage accounts and identities. It's your responsibility to manage any devices that are connected in, and it's your responsibility to manage and protect your information and data. So Microsoft is saying, yeah, we back up Microsoft 365, we back up what's in OneDrive, but their backup is about delivery of the application and the operating environment and the hosts and the network and the data center. Your backup requirement is for your information and data. Remember, you control the permissions, you control what's added and deleted, you need to provide the backup and the recovery capability. And because of that, every time we deploy a customer into Google Workspace or Microsoft 365, we always talk about backup and recovery for the files you have, in OneDrive and SharePoint and MyDrive and ShareDrive on the Workspace side, but also your emails, your contacts, your calendar entries, things of that nature. And it's important that you have that backup because we know that most data loss comes from user action, right? So user accidentally overwrites files, they accidentally delete things, empty their trash, it's gone. You might have an application that's generating files that has an error in it that corrupts a file or overwrites. There are a number of reasons even in the cloud where files can get lost or damaged, right? If you've got a workstation and you're using the Drive for desktop or OneDrive client and you get hit with ransomware, that ransomware is, just like you see your OneDrive or your, Google Drive space as an extension of your local device through the Windows Explorer and the operating system, so will the ransomware, right? So yes, you could have files in OneDrive or files in MyDrive or shared drives, what have you, encrypted by ransomware. It's your responsibility. Just as if it was on a physical file server, you would back up that file server so you could recover those files. You want your files recoverable, backed up for recovery in the cloud as well. So when we go to move to the cloud, we got to start with the planning. And really, for us, we, on the file side, we want to keep it relatively simple because it can get extremely complex. And so we talk about mapping your move. And when you start with the file server, it's really the assessment, right? What are the different directory structures I have, or drives even, or servers? Where, is it personal storage? Is it shared? How is it shared? Is it by department? Is it by project? Is it by work group? And some of this information really an archive that we don't use it actively. It's not touched regularly, but we don't want to get rid of it because we may need it someday, right? And there's certain businesses, consulting engagements, architecture, design, engineering, where work, certain marketing and advertising companies where the work is very much project oriented. Oh, we do a project for a client, the project's done. Excellent. We're not going to touch that data anymore, but you know what? A year from now, if that customer comes back and says, hey, remember you did this work for us, we want to modify it and use it again, or we want to do something different, you want access to that work you've done before and be able to do it. So there's the archive component as well. The next stop is looking at your current permissions. Are they defined? And usually they're defined to some degree, and are they managed? Meaning, as your file servers have grown, maybe you've put in network attached storage or storage area network even. Have you actually actively managed those permissions? Have you changed them, reviewed them, put in policies that you've enforced over time, or has it just grown? And what we find is that, particularly in smaller businesses, they'll set up their file server, and the permissions will be relatively simple, right? This directory, everyone in the accounting department can read and write. These directories, only the CFO can read and write, accounting can read. No one else in the building can view. Here's a directory that accounting can read and write, executive team can view, etc. And then as the hierarchy gets deeper or wider, those rights are inherited. But we've also seen small businesses look and say, gee, that's a lot of administration. So what we're going to do is say we're going to keep, financial items and strategic planning items to the executive team, and everything else will be public to everyone, right? And maybe the department will have read write and everyone else will have read, or just everyone has read write to everything. And so we can see that when you look at your definition and how is it managed, it can be messy because you've tried to maintain it and haven't kept up, or over time it's just grown, or even at some point in time you just simplified permissions and said, you know what, some people might have access to things that they shouldn't, but they don't even know it's there or not. We're not going to worry about it. So in looking at current permissions, is it defined and managed, but also is it appropriate? Do you have the appropriate permissions for the type of data and the type of use type that you have? And sort of look at that in terms of your folder hierarchy. When we map the move now to Cloud File Service, best practice says, hey, we definitely want to separate personal workspace that belongs to me as an individual contributor versus shared space. We want to organize that shared space and create a hierarchy by mapping the current folder hierarchy into a new structure. Do we want it to be department-based? Do we want it to be role or function-based? Do we want it to be project-based? All of those come into play. And with that, at that point in time, it's a time to step back and define permissions, and decide. We recommend creating groups and having people join groups based on the role in the company or their responsibilities. But for certain small businesses, by individual user works well too. And then defining permissions based on levels, right? So whether you're creating a SharePoint file structure in a site, or as a SharePoint file service, or in Teams, you have a level of permissions for that team in Microsoft, or you have a level of permission at the shared drive level in Google Workspace, okay? And by default, everyone will have the same permissions to every subfolder, every folder within that drive, if we use the shared drive example now, and every subfolder to folder and subfolders to subfolders. entirely down the hierarchy as it grows and modifies. Is that enough? I mean, for small businesses that have very simple structures, that's often enough. That's what they need. Oh, we're going to have an accounting share. Everyone accounting, the accounting, our controller will be the manager. Everyone else will be a member with, full edit process. There it goes, right? Other companies might look and say, gee, we need to go another level, right? So, yep, we'll set the permissions on the shared drive, but within that accounting shared drive, we want a folder that the controller and the executive team can view and edit, but the other staff in the accounting department can't, or can't even view. That's where we're going to look at reports and do analysis and confidential information. Payroll might be another folder under accounting, or it could be under HR, wherever, where you might want a different set of permissions on the drive. And so you get into a balancing act. Do I want more shared drives, or do I want to manage multiple levels of folders? When we talk about a best practice, and whether it's in Teams or SharePoint or shared drives, we recommend deciding how many levels down you want to manage permissions and have unique permissions available to a folder, with the understanding that anything below that set number of levels is going to be inherited, right? That you don't want to get into the habit of saying, oh, this folder 5 levels deep, I'm going to modify the permissions instead of using the inherited ones, because that's where it gets hard to manage and maintain. And for most very small businesses, that top level, or what we call level 1, is sufficient. For most of our small, mid-sized customers, 2 levels. On the Google side, it would be at the shared drive level and 1 set of folders beneath. Occasionally, we see a need to do 3 levels. And our recommendation is that that be consistent across all of the shared storage, across the entire cloud file service. So that if you're going to allow for 3 levels deep, you set that up for every single shared drive in Google, for every single SharePoint file server. Maintain your documentation, understand what you're doing, set up the rules for it, and be consistent. You'll keep it simple, you'll keep it easy to maintain, and keep it pretty powerful there as well. And finally, you've mapped your move now. You've created this mapping that says files from here are going to go here. When they get there, they're going to have these permissions, which may or may not be the same as the permissions they have where they came from. Migration is really, I could have, used migration and change management interchangeably. Migration is the change management. Yes, you're physically moving the data and the files from point A to point B, but it's really you're getting the people to now access and use information differently than they have in the past. And so it's important to communicate the why this is happening, the how it's happening, the when to everyone. We recommend sharing information and soliciting feedback, especially concerns. How's my work going to change? Or if you do this, how am I going to do this part of my job? You want to hear those concerns and answer them. That's where the buy-in and the effectiveness and the learning comes. It also tells you what kind of training and education you need. We also recommend that clear expectations be set, saying, hey, once we move to this system, we really don't want any documents being sent as email attachments anymore. We're going to show you how to use the sharing mechanism. We want you to use that. We're going to track that. And guess what? If you notice that people are attaching documents, reinforce with education and training. Unless you're a really small business, going from file servers to file services is best done in phases. And that can either be by department or functional groups. Oftentimes we look and say, you know what, we have a relatively, we have 2 terabytes of data, 400 gig is active. It's stuff we work on, we're touching or have touched in the last X months. Everything else is more static or archive. We have companies that say, hey, let's take everything active and move it in phase 1. We'll do the archive in a future phase, not waiting months or weeks or months, but saying, hey, get the active stuff, get people over and working. We'll bring the archives over. That approach actually, active versus static data, gives you the ability to assess whether you want that static data to move into your productivity suite storage, or whether you want to utilize other storage, other types of cloud file services that are designed for tier 2, or near line or far line storage, which can, if you have a lot of data, can significantly lower your storage and operating costs. And finally, as you do the migration, you want to monitor. Exceptions are going to happen. You're going to get a file name that is illegal. You're going to get potentially a path in a file name that's too long. You're going no migration tool is perfect. And so monitoring, reporting, and managing and addressing those exceptions as part of the migration process is something that needs to be done. What we generally find, even though there's some fabulous tools, and we use some of them, we use some great tools when we do migrations for clients, what we find is that oftentimes the learning curve on how to do a successful migration can outweigh the effort to actually do the migration as well. So, it's not on the slide, but clearly, we're in this business. And experience and knowledge matters. We can prevent a lot of problems. We know how to address them when they come into play. And so getting expert help in doing your migration can dramatically reduce the stress, the time, and the error rate of getting from point A to point B, and certainly help you address and identify end user stresses and issues and get those resolved and get that buy-in and get things running and being utilized in an effective way very quickly. So what's the takeaway? What's the action plan from here, right? We've talked about sort of file server versus file services, why you want to make that move, the components, when to consider taking that step. Now, you might be doing some on-premise and some in the cloud already. Most small businesses that are already running Google Workspace or Microsoft 365 are in that position. So we always recommend starting with an assessment. Let's look at your current file services. How are they structured? How are they permissioned? How much administration are you doing? How much isn't getting done that you should be doing? Are you compliant with your policies, with any rules and regulations you're subject to? And what is the opportunities of change? And so this is saying, what aren't you able to do that you want to do or that you need to do? Or that maybe if you did, you'd be more efficient and your team could be more productive if you made a change to more cloud file services. And so this isn't just an assessment, is it A or B? It's really, here's how I'm operating now. Here's how I would be operating if I moved over to cloud file services or consolidated into my cloud file services. And here are things, so I could do what I'm doing now, and maybe it's a little different, but here's some other things I could be doing that, and how can I take advantage of those? And use that assessment to build the value and define the value proposition. And value proposition isn't just cost benefit analysis. Think about the benefits of moving forward with a move to cloud file services, as well as the impact of inaction. So any inefficiencies you have aren't going to get fixed. Any problems you have, any overhead, any concerns you have aren't going to get fixed unless you take action. And what does that cost you? What does it cost you? Not necessarily in hard dollars, but opportunity cost, motivation, productivity, etc. For most businesses, we think if you do the assessment and think about the value proposition, the cost and effort and time necessarily needed to make the move is well worth it. And from there, again, it's planned and a tactical level, right? Where you say, hey, strategically, this is what we're going to do. This is where we're going to head. Tactically, here's a set of 5 projects in the order we're going to do them to get there. And again, phase it if is appropriate. Provide the education and training and the change management. That's all planned out, and then you execute, and you can be successful. And so on that, I want to open it up to we'll head into our Q&A session. And so now, if you have any questions, don't have any yet, but feel free to open up that question Q&A window and ask your questions online. I am going to step to the last slide here, and for those of you who are watching this, on demand, on the screen right now, you have the company contact information. You also have my personal contact information. I don't have an assistant, so that email goes to my inbox. That phone number rings on my desk, on my cell phone, etc. I will tell you I'm much better at answering emails than voicemails. And my day's pretty busy, so it's hard to get me on the phone. Best way to contact me is email if you want to talk to me directly. If you just have a question or want someone on my team to reach back, info@cumulusglobal.com. If not, afalcon@cumulusglobal.com. Feel free at any time to send off an email with any questions, concerns, ideas. Happy to chat. No, we're not going to sell you or try to sell you something. We're going to talk to you about what you're trying to achieve, talk about options, and we'll work from there. Oftentimes, we will point people in a direction or point out a capability that they already have that they're unaware of, and they don't need to make a change. So feel free to reach out and talk. Again, for those watching on the on demand, thank you so much for joining us, and have a great day and week.